At the time this started happening, I had moved to Kentucky to work as a firefighter. I bought 10 square miles of hilly forest with a home at an auction. The old owner lived there his whole life, died on the land, and his family sold it cheap to make a quick buck. Once I arrived, I started planting more trees. The forest was plenty dense, but the area around the house needed a few more. I had put up trail cams because homeless wanderers were sneaking onto the property. From time to time, the trail cams were being ripped down though. Some of them were the ones I had put way up in the trees. At one point, I found a pile of them stashed in a tree hollow. When that happened, I grabbed my camping supplies and went out to find a homeless man and persuade him to leave the property. I searched for a while, but couldn't find anyone. The only thing of note were some tiny four-toed footprints in the mud by the streams. They looked like a raccoon's, but the spacing made it look like they were standing up. I made camp and hunkered down for the night, cooked up a tasty rabbit stew. Later on, I went into the tent and went to sleep before cleaning the pot because of how tired I was. Around 3 a.m, I woke up, moon shining through the trees. I heard a high-pitched grunting noise from outside my tent. Sounds like it's something small. I open up a window flap on the tent. The stew pot is swinging, but I can't see anything near it except for a mossy rock about the size of a gallon jug that I hadn't noticed there before. At the time, I thought nothing of it and went back to sleep. I woke up and went to look for the stew pot to cook some breakfast. The pot had been licked clean, and the mossy rock was gone. I assumed some raccoons must have cleaned it in the middle of the night, and the rock was the fat lump that did it. I packed up to go search some more. I couldn't find anyone. But at the time, I swore the rocks around me were alive. They all seemed to be moving whenever I looked away from them. No real sense of dread in all this, just general bewilderment. During the search, I lost a knife that I had had for a very long while. It's cheap, but had sentimental value. I went home, tired and bummed out from not finding anyone and losing my knife. I went immediately to bed. But a few hours later, I woke up to a light knocking on my door. I was plenty groggy and went to go open it. I peeked through the window, but there was no one there. So I opened the door and poked my head through just in case it was some visiting neighbor. But there was no one. Only forest noises and the occasional moth. I stepped out the door and kicked something. I looked down. My knife was laying there on a small bed of flowers and grass. I look around me, really confused, but generally happy that someone found my knife, but then angry that someone was on my property and watching me. I shout out as loud as I can a quick thanks, and request that if someone's out there to come out so I can talk to them. Nobody does. I do notice about 3 rocks, all roughly the size of a milk jug, in a row at the border of the forest. I pick up the knife and walk back inside. Out of curiosity, I glance back out. The rocks were gone. I bought a border collie the next day just so that I could have something around to alert me as to what might be going on. About a month after the porch incident, I was planting more trees and working some land to make a garden. The pupper, whom I've named Hugo, was walking around sniffing the place out, doing typical puppy things. While tilling, I noticed 2 rocks on the edge of the forest. I think nothing of it. They don't bother me, and I don't bother them. At this point, I'm kind of used to their presence, and honestly expect them to show up at some point on a regular basis. They don't ever really cause me to be afraid, and Hugo doesn't mind them much either. For a while I was really into my gardening, and lost track of time. I look up and notice that Hugo is gone. I'm freaking out because I really love the little guy. I look around frantically, and see him over by the edge of the forest, sniffing one of the rocks. The rock he's sniffing shifts a little when his nose gets close to it. I get up to run over to Hugo, to keep him from getting hurt or something in case a rock tips over on him. That's when I see the moss on the rock shift and sprout a tiny, spindly little arm. I stop walking for a second and blink to make sure I'm not hallucinating. It's hot and humid, and I haven't been drinking as much water as I probably should. The arm continues to extend slowly and tentatively towards Hugo, recoiling a little whenever Hugo's nose touches it. I start moving closer, while trying to be cautious not to spook the rock. I'm near to Hugo, maybe 50 feet away, and see that it's petting Hugo's head. Hugo is wagging his tail, and generally seems to be enjoying it. I get about 20 feet away when I step on a twig and make a loud noise. The creature's arm shoots back into its body, and the rock starts tumbling away frantically. Hugo runs after them, and I run after Hugo. I lose sight of them, and search for Hugo until nightfall. I then went back to my house to grab my camping gear and a flashlight to find Hugo. As I get closer, I see a black and white lump on the porch. I start running towards the house, and as I get closer, I see that it's Hugo. He's laying on the porch, not moving. I was getting more upset. As I get closer, I see red and pink around his head and neck. I start sprinting, thinking my dog is hurt or dead. I get maybe 10 feet away when Hugo's head jerks up and looks at me. He stands up and heads over my way, clearly happy to see me. There's a little crown of red and pink flowers around his head and neck, and a rope has been tied to his collar, with the other end tied to my door. I hug him, tears welling up because I've come to love this little pupper so much. I stand up and shout a thank you to whoever brought him home. Over the next year, I had gotten much closer to the rocks, and I've built up a bit of trust with the little things. They were getting more comfortable moving closer and closer towards me. That next summer, I noticed one of them had taken up residence in my garden. This one is a little different from the others. It's a greenish gray and very round, almost spherical. Every now and then I take a peek out the window and catch a glimpse of it moving around, very slowly and methodically. The garden has never looked more beautiful since after it moved in. I go into my garden often, and whenever I am in with it, it will move to the opposite side. One day I decided to go up to it and try to show it I mean no harm. I am unsuccessful at this, as it just tucks its arms and legs in whenever it sees me. These things have no mouth or nose from what I can tell, just two beady eyes. I decide to leave it alone most of the time. It seems to be helping me with the garden, and I appreciate that. Occasionally I notice that some of my veggies are gone, or half-eaten and laying by the stone. I let it have them, and start leaving some veggies near the edge of the forest. One day, I notice that the stone in the garden is gone. The veggies are no longer being eaten, and the garden is looking just a little bit worse for the wear. The stones are also gone from the tree line around my house. I was genuinely sad that they were gone. About 2 weeks later, I go into the forest to look for them. I made my way to about the middle of my property, where a massive tree had fallen. It was some type of oak, possibly over 100 feet tall. When I got closer, I noticed that there were a few dozen stones on or around it, all leaning on it, like they were kissing it, or resting their heads on it. I remember being overwhelmed with a sudden sense of sadness, almost like a family member had died. I walk over to the tree and place my hand on it, and say a quick prayer in front of the stones. I went back home after spending 3 hours at the tree, feeling as though bereft of an old friend. At that point, I remember having a white oak sapling in my yard outside of my house. I dug it up, and took it to the bigger oak in the forest the next day with Hugo, and planted it next to the fallen oak. Hugo is walking around to the stones. I catch a glimpse of a few of them petting him. A few days later, I notice the stones are back at the edge of the forest. The garden stone is back as well, and everything looks lush and vibrant again. One time I was out patrolling the forest with Hugo, mostly just to say hi to some friends who live nearby, but also to check for bums and generally be outdoors. As I go further out, I notice more and more signs of a homeless person living in the area. Trash was everywhere, and there were broken branches and plants. I finally make it to where I think the guy is camping. I find a shelter and take it down, but neatly fold it for him so he can get off my property quickly. It starts to get dark, and I'm getting a little worried that I missed him, or he's dead somewhere on my property. I notice someone moving deeper into the forest. I shout at him to stop and talk to me. The guy has a pickaxe. I got my shotgun ready just in case. I see he's smashing something with it. I freak out a little thinking I've stumbled onto a killing. That's when I hear the unmistakable sound of rocks being smashed. I fire into the air to get his attention quickly. He drops his pickaxe and puts his hands up, mumbling something unintelligible. My adrenaline was pumping. I was shaking, and Hugo was going mad on his leash. I screamed at him about smashing the rocks. He starts saying how they were following him and throwing stuff at him. I almost shot him then and there, but instead I led him at gunpoint to the edge of my property and told him to get out and never come back. A few days later, I get a call from the sheriff's office about a body they found near my property. It's a homeless guy, beaten to death and stuffed into a tree. I'm told there will be a deputy stopping by later to talk to me about it. The deputy shows up about an hour later and questions me if I had any interactions with the homeless guy. I tell him no, and he starts to leave. He turns around on my porch, mentions my stone fence is a little low, but looks good. I look around. The entire edge of the forest around my house is surrounded by stones. I tell him thanks and see him to his cruiser. He leaves and I look back at my house. All the stones are gone except for 2. I received gifts from them from time to time, usually flowers, sometimes morel mushrooms, or things I've lost. I've been giving them about 1/3 of my veggies, and they seem to like that. More and more show up in my yard, rather than at the tree line, and they only seem to move when they don't notice me there. They're very slow moving, and the only time I've seen them move quickly is when they roll. I have a lot more animals in my area now, and the yard and garden are always much lusher when they are around. They seem to disappear during storms. I think they either go into tree hollows or patiently wait it out under other kinds of cover. The garden rock likes to go into a small covered trellis I built for it when the rains come. I've never heard them speak, and have only seen their faces a few times. It's just an oblong rock, with beady black eyes that looked like polished black glass. They have very spindly arms and legs, but they aren't bony, more like a vine. They can tuck their arms and legs back into their body to the point where they aren't noticeable. They have 4 toes and 3 fingers with a thumb. Their bodies are kind of bullet-shaped, and they are about the size of a gallon jug. The garden rock is more round, though. Their head sits on the front of their body rather than on top, and kind of blends into it. The eyes are wide-spaced, almost parallel to each other, and about the size of a small marble. The creatures are covered in moss, and can range from green to burgundy. I think that might indicate their age, but I don't know.